Another legend is in the news around this time, but this time it's a sad anniversary. Freddie Blassie passed away on June 2nd, 2003. What are your memories of Freddie? We've talked about him a little bit on the show, but he's always been sort of regarded as the elder statesman of the company. Any good Freddie Blassie stories you can share with us?
No, none that I can tell on the podcast. Freddie Blassie was the first American heel to go to Japan after World War II. And he was notorious in Japan, working with Ricky Dozan and Giant Baba. A classic heel's heel. Fred Blassie, perfect bleach blonde hair, perfectly styled, always dressed to a T, which is how he came up with the name Classy Freddie Blassie as a manager in later years. But Blassie used to, with pride, talk to you about how when he was working the Los Angeles territory, and he would pull his shirt up or take his shirt off and show you all the stab wounds all over his body. And like, yeah, I got stabbed right here from some son of a bitch, and he came and I got stabbed over here and I got cut here and I did this and my eye got taken out over here. There was pride in getting that heat and being a heel that Freddie Blassie had, but there wasn't a better human being that loved kids more and just an all-round great guy. That I'm extremely proud to call friend and say that I knew through the years. Blassie was one of the best. Old school class.
No doubt about it. I mean, that's what everybody says. Let's talk about the June 2nd Raw. Show opens with Rock getting out of a limo, and he's going to be on the highlight reel. Says he's here for the fans, pretty much turning himself babyface. And he was a heel most recently, last losing to Goldberg at the Backlash pay-per-view. This is an interesting time for The Rock. Talk to me about sort of how The Rock stood with the company here in the summer of 2003.
Well, this was kind of during the time where Vince came up with the phrase, Rock can't be a heel. He's shitting on the audience, but he's shitting ice cream. They love it. They want more. So Vince felt he was fighting the tide trying to keep Rock heel, but Rock was in and out. Rock was out doing Hollywood stuff. He was making movies, and he was starting his run to be the biggest celebrity in the world at this point, and it's taken a while for him to get there, but this was during the time he was making the transition from the ring to being in front of the camera and being behind the camera in Hollywood. So we didn't have him full time.
We also see on this show where Bischoff and Steve Austin agree to compete in what they're calling a redneck triathlon. I gotta hear who fucking pitched this bullshit. Now, don't get me wrong. It winds up being half funny, half entertaining, but I mean, what the hell is this idea?
Okay. Let me preface a lot of this with, I talked to a few people that I worked with during this time frame in the company, because watching the pay-per-view, as I had texted you, it was the parts of it that were extremely brutal. And as I'm going back and I'm like, jog my memory on this, what the hell were we doing here? We all kind of had the general consensus of this was a time in the company where creative even hated creative. And we were trying to get by. We were writing shows to get through the next day and just be done with it and move on to the next week. And it was painful sometimes, but it was not always the best. And the triathlon, the redneck triathlon, was you had Steve, who was going through some injury stuff. So Steve couldn't take any offense. Steve could give somebody something, but he couldn't take anything. So Steve was being protected that way from physicality. And then you've got Eric, who's a heel, and Vince wanted to keep Steve good, and he had to have them both on TV all the time. Well, let's have them compete. What will we do? We had an idea early on of what it could be, and they could compete in an Olympics of sorts in Texas, the Texas Olympics. And then Vince came up with the redneck triathlon. And that's how we came to it. But the original ideas behind it were different than what actually took place.
So we'll talk about it in a minute. Let's talk about this Goldberg skit here, because Goldberg shows up to Raw here in one of those classic cars that we've talked about a lot here that Goldberg has maybe had some trouble with. You can hear more about that in our Goldberg episode, but this is the episode where Jericho is shown pouring paint all over Goldberg's car, and then he takes off. So as a result, Christian winds up stepping in with his new look. Once Vince compelled him to do that. And so now, he, instead of having the highlight reel, which is what was originally advertised for Jericho, Christian's taken over and he's calling it the Peep Show. And his guest, of course, is the guest from the highlight reel. It's The Rock, who comes out to a huge pop, does the finally gimmick. And believe it or not, Christian cuts him off and does it himself. And Christian starts talking about how he's the new people's champion and he's on fire here. What'd you think of Christian and The Rock here? This is a big opportunity for Christian because he had sort of been seen as a tag team guy, and now he's out there jabbing with The Rock.
He always had played kind of a backseat to Edge as well. And I think that anybody that saw the Hall of Fame this past year at WWE, to me, Christian was the star of the show. Edge and Christian both were excellent when they kept coming out and doing their cameos, but inducting the Dudleys. And just the facials of Christian, you see what classic timing he has. And only a few people saw that. Brian Gewirtz was somebody he loved writing for Christian because Christian had input and they worked very well together. And Brian saw this talent. Brian saw the humor and the wit that Christian had and wrote to that. And I think that Christian delivered it well because nobody cut The Rock off, and The Rock liked Christian too. So he was willing to go with it as well. It was good stuff. It was different because we hadn't done that before.
One of my favorite lines from this whole thing was, when Rock is sort of, shitting on Christian and he says, Christian's daddy is a hoe. And Christian replies, he's a pediatrician. And I don't know why, but that's such a classic response. Great stuff. Go out of your way to check out some of this stuff on this Raw. Believe it or not, Jericho returns here and he gets in the mix and he tells Rock, I'm not getting speared on Sunday. So I want to know what it feels like, because of course Goldberg just beat The Rock. So pretty fun stuff here. Booker comes in, gets involved as well. And eventually Christian and Jericho run off. We see Booker and Rock have some fun with a Rockaroony and Booker doing a people's elbow. Next up, we've got Rene Dupree working with Kane. Of course, we're setting up a tag team match there. Booker T and Goldust are working with Christian and Jericho. And afterwards, this is when we see Goldberg return to spear Jericho. And then we find out that Austin has to secure a different type of referee for the Hell in a Cell, because none of the referees will agree to work in the Hell in a Cell. And this skit where all the referees are sort of bowing out of this opportunity is pretty well done here. Whose idea is it to sort of play off of Tim White's situation in the Hell in a Cell and all the real life stuff that's happened in these matches as a reason to have a special guest referee in Mick Foley?
Well, Mick was back and looking for something to do, and it was kind of a one-off type of situation, a short-term deal, but it was tied to the Hell in a Cell. And Mick was obviously in the most classic Hell in a Cell, not the original one, but Mick taking the bump, and Mick had taken some crazy bumps and done some crazy shit in the Hell in a Cell. So it was logical that the guy that had seen the most damage, albeit to himself, Mick Foley, be the referee, that he could handle whatever kind of punishment the cell could dish out. And that was the logic behind it, to bring him in and get the referees in a position where they didn't want to have anything to do with it.